Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging headfirst into some, well, intriguing and sometimes pretty unsettling challenges facing Menifee, California.
Yeah, it's a city growing incredibly fast, but it seems like there's a lot happening behind the scenes.
Exactly, almost like a city hall showdown, you could say. It really speaks to public frustration and a growing call for just transparency.
Hmm.
So, our mission today is to pull out the key insights from a whole stack of sources we've looked at, detailing these different problems in Menifee.
Right. We've got stuff on leadership changes, political finance issues.
Stalled projects, controversies over public funds, it's quite a mix.
It really is.
And the goal is to leave you, our listener, feeling well-informed with a clear picture of what's actually been going on. We'll look at specifics, but also try to uncover those bigger themes like, trust, transparency, how the city's being managed.
So good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's unpack this with the leadership situation. Some really high-level departures at City Hall.
Yeah, I saw that. A pattern, almost.
Definitely a pattern. High-ranking folks put on paid administrative leave, but with basically no public explanation. That immediately makes you wonder.
Of course.
Yeah.
Transparency concerns right off the bat.
So first up, Armando Villa. He's the city manager. He was put on leave back in October 2023.
And that lasted a while, didn't it?
It did, until February 2024. It started with a split 3-2 city council vote.
Oh.
He only came back after a unanimous 5-0 vote, following what they called a comprehensive and internal personnel investigation.
But they never said what the investigation found.
Nope. Specifics not disclosed. And this went on for nearly 4 months.
Wow. Well, crucially, that kind of silence.
Yeah.
It just fuels public guesswork, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
When top people vanish without a word, people start thinking mismanagement, maybe backroom deals, especially when the investigation details are kept under wraps. That kind of secrecy, it can really eat away at public trust. And just practically speaking, it makes a city harder to run smoothly with all that leadership churn.
And it wasn't just him. Rochelle Clayton, she was the assistant city manager.
Right. She was on leave around the same time, October 2023.
Yeah, concurrently with Villa. What's interesting there is she then left Menifee completely in April 2024.
Oh, where did she go?
She went to San Bernardino initially, and now she's set to become the city manager of Barstow in February 2025.
So
Yeah.
she moved on up, essentially.
Seems like it. But she oversaw really critical departments in Menifee Police, Fire, IT, and again, zero public reason given for her leave.
Yeah, her leaving for another city, especially after a 6-month unexplained absence, that doesn't just look like losing an employee. It kind of signals potential internal problems, maybe.
Could be. Or maybe a lack of confidence in where Menifee was heading.
Right. And when you lose key people running vital services like police and fire, that definitely shakes public confidence, creates this feeling of instability.
And if you thought that was it. Well, it keeps going. This is what's really unsettling.
There's more.
Yeah. We found Cheryl Kitzrow, the planning director, was placed on leave very recently, March 2025.
Same story. No explanation.
Same story, no public explanation. So that's 3 high-profile leaves in just 18 months.
Wow. That really does paint a picture
Yeah.
of something going on with leadership stability.
Doesn't it? And then there's Ron Puccinelli, the IT director. With him, we couldn't find any public information confirming if he was terminated or even on leave.
So just ambiguity.
Total ambiguity,
Yeah.
which just adds to that feeling that maybe there are issues being hidden.
That pattern is so important. It suggests it's not just isolated incidents. Maybe it's a systemic thing, some deep conflict,
Yeah,
pushing out people with institutional knowledge.
could be. And potentially stalling long-term plans.
Exactly. And the lack of clarity around someone like Puccinelli, the IT director, that just adds to the uncertainty. It makes it really hard for residents to know what's happening at the top.
And undermines their faith in consistent governance.
Absolutely.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about money. Specifically, the financial conduct of some political figures.
Yes, the political finance angle.
Right. So Scott Mann, he's the former mayor, he got hit with a massive $60,000 fine from the FPPC, that's the state's Fair Political Practices Commission, back in 2016.
60,000. That's a hefty fine. What was it for?
For misusing almost $45,000 in campaign funds. And we're not talking small errors here.
Like what kind of spending?
The sources detail things like personal expenses, a family wedding in Malibu.
Wow. Campaign funds for a wedding?
Yep. Car registration too. And meals like over 100 different times between 2009 and 2014.
Okay, that's pretty blatant.
He did end up reimbursing about $17,000 and paid the fine from his own money. But yeah, the scandal definitely didn't help him.
I bet. Probably contributed to him losing his election and resigning.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah.
Looking at the bigger picture, incidents like that, Scott Mann's misuse of funds, they're really powerful examples of how individual actions can just wreck public trust.
For sure.
It feeds that perception that maybe elected officials aren't always working for the public, but, for themselves.
Right. Personal gain.
Yeah. And that kind of scandal, it just reinforces the idea that there might be underlying governance problems, makes people question the integrity of their leaders, sets a pretty low bar for accountability expectations down the road.
And then there is Lisa Sobek. She's a councilwoman. She also faced FPPC violations in 2016.
Okay. Was hers similar? A big fine?
Actually, no. That's the notable part. No fine was imposed in her case.
Any idea what the violations were?
Details are a bit unclear, but likely something related to campaign finance or disclosures. It's worth mentioning she later became mayor in 2024.
Interesting contrast. Mann gets a huge fine, Sobek gets violations, but no fine around the same time.
Yeah. And speaking of investigations, there was this alleged 39-month FPPC investigation into the city of Menifee itself.
An investigation into the whole city for 39 months.
That was the claim. Supposedly, it was just mysteriously dropped. But, and this is important, we need to be clear, no evidence was found to actually verify this happened.
Okay. So it's more like an unconfirmed rumor.
Exactly. Seems that way.
Right.
But the fact that the rumor exists might reflect those broader transparency concerns people have.
Yeah, that contrast between Mann's big fine and Sobek's situation, even if her violations were minor, it adds to the complexity, how people see things.
True.
It's not just about the specific actions, but how they all add up to this sort of general feeling of unease.
Right.
And that unverified claim about a long-dropped investigation, even if it's not proven, it says a lot about the public's hunger for answers. They want transparency.
Definitely.
It really highlights how speculation can just run wild when official information feels incomplete or closed off. Unconfirmed stories start to gain traction.
Okay, so this City Hall showdown isn't just about people and money trails. It's actually left visible marks on Menifee's landscape.
Affecting residents' daily lives too, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. For them, it's become a story of, broken promises and things just left hanging. Unfinished business.
Like what specifically?
Let's kick off with the Krikorian Theater fiasco. You might have heard about this one.
Vaguely. It was supposed to be a big entertainment complex?
Exactly. A major development. But construction just stopped. Halted in April 2020, largely due to COVID-19.
And it just sat there, unfinished.
Yep. Partial structures, left standing. The developer apparently put in over $20 million.
Ouch.
Then things got worse. The city declared it a public nuisance in June 2024. Graffiti, even a fire.
Not good.
And then a judge approved its demolition in September 2024. So imagine you're a resident driving past that half-built, decaying site every day for years.
Yeah. What message does that send?
That's the key question, isn't it? These really visible failed projects, they're not just about money lost.
No, they become these constant physical reminders. Like, here's what we were promised and here's what we got.
Exactly. It reinforces that whole narrative of mismanagement. Makes people deeply skeptical about any future projects.
Understandably. Will they actually happen? Will they benefit us?
Right. And that kind of visible failure, it really hits community morale hard, and it could definitely hurt future development prospects. Makes it tougher for the city to get support for anything big.
Definitely. A tough cycle to break.
Then there's the Cherry Hills Golf Course. This was apparently a fixture in Sun City, part of Menifee, since like 1969.
Okay, long-standing community spot.
Right. But it was sold to a developer, Ambient Communities, in January 2024.
And what happened?
They closed it immediately.
Just like that. Wow. Residents must have been upset.
Very. Serious concerns voiced about what might replace it. Residential development, commercial.
Losing green space, maybe more density.
Exactly. They've vowed to fight any zoning changes. The sources do mention its poor condition might have contributed to the closure, to be fair.
Still, closing a long-time amenity like that.
Yeah. And just to clarify, we didn't find any info about a separate North Golf Course that was sometimes mentioned. Seems focused on Cherry Hills.
Okay. But the closure of a place like that, especially with unclear future plans from the developer.
Right.
Yeah, that creates major community unrest.
For sure.
People aren't just losing, say, a place to golf. It's part of their community's identity,
Mm-hmm.
And the uncertainty fuels fear. Fear of losing green space, fear of more traffic.
Right. leads to opposition against city planning, creates this adversarial vibe between residents and City Hall.
Yeah, it makes cooperation really difficult.
And finally, one more project example, the amphitheater shade cover.
Okay, what's the story there?
This was a $7 million project planned for Central Park's amphitheater, approved back in December 2023.
$7 million for a shade cover. Seems like a lot, but okay.
Well, it's faced delays, but more than that, there have been allegations of an irregular bidding process.
Any proof? Specific evidence found.
Nothing specific mentioned in what we reviewed, but here's the thing. Public comments describe the whole process as feeling fishy.
So even without concrete proof, the perception is there.
Exactly. And that perception, that underlying distrust we've been talking about, it just surfaces again.
Yeah, that feeling of a fishy process, even if it's just a feeling, it can be almost as damaging as proving something went wrong.
How so?
Well, it suggests residents are already kind of primed to be skeptical about how public money is being handled.
Right. They're starting from a place of doubt.
Exactly. And that kind of public sentiment, when you add in visible project delays, it just locks in that narrative.
Yeah.
The city isn't operating transparently or efficiently.
Which makes it incredibly hard for them to get public support for future things.
Yeah, no matter how good those future ideas might actually be.
Yeah.
That trust deficit is a killer.
Okay, so if stalled projects and these leadership questions weren't enough, there's another layer, how the city handles money. Specifically, public funds that residents actually voted for.
The tax money angle.
Precisely. This brings us to the whole controversy around Measure DD.
Measure DD, that was a sales tax increase, right?
Yep, a 1% sales tax hike, approved by a pretty solid margin, 68% of voters, back in November 2016.
Okay. And how was it sold to the public? What was it supposed to fund?
That's the key point. It was heavily promoted as being for public safety, police, fire, and infrastructure improvements.
Sounds reasonable. So what's the controversy?
The criticism is that it was presented in a misleading way.
How so?
Well, while it was promoted for those specific things, the tax revenue actually goes into the city's general fund.
Which means they can use it more broadly, more flexibly.
Exactly. It's not strictly ring-fenced just for police and fire, like many voters apparently thought.
Okay, I see the issue. That's a big difference. It creates this gap between what voters thought they were approving
and how the money could actually be spent.
Right. And that's striking, isn't it? How the perception of transparency, or the lack of it, affects whether people accept these funding measures, even one that passed with 68% support.
Totally. And this failing of being misled, it wasn't just grumbling, it actually led to action.
Oh, yeah. What happened?
A resident-led petition managed to get Measure M on the ballot in 2020.
Measure M. What was that?
Its whole purpose was to repeal Measure DD, citing exactly these concerns about how the money was being used versus how it was promoted.
Wow. So citizens tried to undo the tax increase. Did it pass?
No, the repeal effort failed in the end. Measure DD stayed. But the fact that they got it on the ballot, that such a strong effort was made, that speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does. That kind of citizen-led repeal attempt,
Yeah.
it highlights a really deep distrust about how funds are allocated.
Definitely.
When people feel like public money isn't being used as promised, or maybe that the initial pitch was, kind of like propaganda, it can seriously undermine the city's credibility. Makes it way harder to get support for future financial needs, even if they're totally legitimate.
Yeah.
It's not just menifee either.
Yeah.
This is like a classic example of that trust deficit that can really plague local governments everywhere.
So, wrapping this all up, what does it all mean for you, our listener? Menifee's journey, from these unexplained leaves at the top
To the political money scandals.
and these big stalled projects.
Yeah.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? A consistent pattern of governance challenges.
Yeah, it's a really vivid snapshot of a fast-growing city kind of grappling, sometimes clumsily, with pretty complex civic issues. And if we connect it all to the bigger picture, these issues just screen for more openness, more accountability in local government.
Right.
What's fascinating, too, is that contrast you see. Some issues have clear documents, hard evidence, right?
Right.
Like the Krikorian Theater getting demolished or Scott Mann's FTPC fine. You can point to those.
Sure.
But then you have the other stuff lacking public evidence. That alleged 39-month FPPC probe that vanished, or, what exactly happened with Rob Puccinelli.
Yeah, the ambiguity.
Exactly. But both types of issues, the documented ones and the ambiguous ones, they both end up feeding public speculation. And they fuel that powerful desire for real transparency.
That makes sense.
And Even if some of these specific problems get resolved eventually, or are maybe being worked on now, their collective legacy, that history, it contributes to this broader climate of distrust in the community.
Which just makes governing that much harder going forward.
Absolutely. It's a significant challenge.
It really does hammer home how vital transparency and public trust are, especially at the local level. So, thinking about everything we've discussed with Menifee, it leaves me wondering, and maybe you too, what kind of proactive steps do you think a growing city can take, to try and stop these kinds of challenges from eroding public trust before they even start?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Building trust from the ground up.
Something for us all to think about.